So hello everyone, welcome to today's BSc Nutrition and Medical Sciences taster session. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very happy to have you all. My name is Anisa and currently I'm a MSc student on the dietetics program here at UCL. I'm also your chair for this afternoon. So we're hoping this session will address those course-specific questions you may have and will help you gain an insight into what it's really like to study on the Nutrition and Medical Sciences undergraduate program. So this afternoon, our speaker, who is Dr. Adrian Slee here, he will provide you with an exciting insight into the field of nutrition and medical sciences. So this session will look at how you can apply nutritional assessment in both theory and in practice, which is what we'll also be covering in the actual course. So this will also provide a summary of the BSc Nutrition and Medical Sciences program, and there'll be a Q&A session and plenty of interactive opportunities. So do join in with all the questions and pop your answers in the Q&A section. So I would just say this session is being recorded and will be made available on the website following today's event. So we're here to, and as I said, respond to your questions. So please share those throughout using the Q&A function on Zoom. So to introduce our speaker, we have Dr. Adrian Slee. Adrian is a course director for the BSc Nutrition and Medical Sciences program at UCL. He's also a registered nutritionist and he teaches and coordinates several modules on both the undergraduate and MSc programs. Dr. Slee also conducts research examining the importance of malnutrition in aging and how this relates to frailty. Thank you, Dr. Slee. Now it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Anisa. So I'm going to share my screen. So we're just going to do a little session, just give you a taste of some of the interesting things that we cover in the nutrition degree. And we're going to do that for about 20 minutes, and then we'll do an overview of the course. 1 second, here we go. So we're going to cover in particular a very interesting topic, which is energy balance, that some of you may have heard of before. And we can look at specifically why it's important, why we want to study this thing and how to study it. Because there are different ways of measuring energy balance in the body. And we cover some of this in our course, okay, in the BSc Nutrition Medical Science degree. And we'll cover at the end some specific things related to the course. And Anisa can help us with some specific things because she studied the BSc degree a couple of years ago now and is now doing dietetics. So what do we mean by the term energy balance? So it'd be great if you guys could tell us what you think. So using the question and answer, using the Q&A, what do you think? Anyone heard of the term energy balance before? What does it relate to? Who would like to give it a go? Anyone at all? Amelia's, she says, every cell in the body receiving equal amounts of energy. That's one idea.
Got another answer that says balance of where energy comes from in food.
Okay. Oh, we've got a good one from Yasmin, haven't we?
Balancing energy input and output to make sure that we're not using more than we are taking in.
And as well, we've got, as an anonymous attendee, perhaps the balance between the number of calories we consume and use. Very good. And Molly says, could it be related to how much we eat in comparison to how much we... Absolutely. So some very good answers there. So it is related to the balance between the energy that we consume from food and drink and the energy that we expend. So at rest, so just having your cells just respiring, using energy to function, and then also during physical activity, for example. So we're interested in energy balance for lots of different reasons. In nutrition specifically, we're interested in conditions where you might have, say, positive energy balance, where energy intake is greater than energy expenditure. And so, for example, this is something that happens during development of obesity. So if someone's in positive energy balance for a long period of time, so it could be many months and many years, then that excess energy is essentially stored, and a lot of that is stored as fat mass. So, for example, subcutaneous fat, basically the fatty tissue underneath the skin or around the organs, for example. This obviously increases body weight. And we know, for example, in the UK, And in the developing world, we have a major public health crisis with the rise in obesity and type 2 diabetes. So this is just one aspect that we cover, for example, during our course. And we have a specific module in our second year BSc degree specifically titled Malnourishment and Obesity, where we look at this in great depth. We could look at the other end of the spectrum. So if a person is in negative energy balance, which could be acutely or it could be chronic, for example. So we talk about examples of disease-related malnutrition, where someone might have a clinical condition. So it could be, for example, something like cancer or chronic kidney disease, and that has a negative effect on energy balance. So for example, a person might, because their cells might be working harder because of the effects of disease. So we have something called inflammation, and that affects how hard our cells work, essentially. So that might increase energy expenditure, even if someone's completely physically inactive in a hospital bed. And at the same time, energy intake might drastically decrease because someone's unwell, they don't feel like eating, they have anorexia, for example. And we know this loss of weight, and specifically loss of muscle as well, increases the overall risk of morbidity and mortality. So these are really important things that we need to understand, to study. How do you think we could assess energy balance and nutritional status? What do we think? So another question for you guys. So you've got two components. You've got the energy intake and you've got the energy expenditure. How could we measure this? Any ideas? You might have seen stuff on TV, for example. There have been some quite famous TV programs where people have been tested and assessed, usually celebrities. Any ideas at all? What could we do? Do we have anyone?
Oh, we've got maybe a couple.
Good stuff.
So through calculating your BMI.
Yes, yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's good. So Snea, what do you mean by BMI? So, because I'm looking at Yasmin as well, so testing your metabolism, checking your BMI. So, I'm assuming you mean body mass index. So, does everyone know what body mass index is? What do we mean by BMI? So the body mass index is a weight to height index, and we'll talk about that in a few slides later. So there is potentially one way to look at essentially the size of a person and how much tissue they have. That's one way to do it. It's not the most accurate way of doing it, but it's one way. So Yasmin, when you say testing your metabolism, checking your BMI, I wasn't sure if you meant BMR, because when you test your metabolism, there's something called basal metabolic rate as well. So I wasn't sure if you were getting confused there. But you could test your metabolism. There's ways you can do that, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. And Snea, yeah, you're completely right. Yes, so weight for height, absolutely. Good stuff. So what can we do? So in terms of assessing intake, the first thing we can do is we can estimate energy and macronutrient intake. So when we talk about macronutrients, we're talking about carbohydrates, proteins, and fats from the diet, from food and from drink. So we can look at intake. We can look at energy expenditure, so your metabolism. We can check how many calories you're burning per day. There's ways we can do that. And similar to what you mentioned with BMI, we can look at body size and body composition. Because obviously when you store energy, you store it in reserves, for example, protein in muscle, skeletal muscle tissue, and fat in adipose tissue, for example. And so we cover all these things in depth, both theoretically and practically within our course. So the idea we show students how to measure these things, because especially if you become later on, you become a private nutritionist or you become a dietitian, this stuff is absolutely critical. You need to know how to do this and do it accurately. So for example, with dietary analysis, we could estimate intake using diet diaries, okay, and diet recall methods. And the idea is that you log the amounts of food that you consume and amounts and drinks that you consume, the exact quantities if possible, and you can put it into a dietary analysis program. So just for a bit of fun, you can see I've got a pumpkin here because it was Halloween recently. And you can see on the right hand side, this is just a free online resource that I used earlier this week. And you can look at, for example, the amount of calories per unit. So, for example, this is in a serving of 245 grams of mashed pumpkin, for example. And you can look at specifically how much carbohydrate, how much fat, and how much protein is within that food. And within the food, you've got your specific macronutrients that I just mentioned, and they have different food energy values, okay? So, for example, some of you probably heard of before, for example, with fat is very calorie dense. So there's 9 kilocalories per gram within fat, whereas carbohydrate and protein is less energy dense, and there's 4 kilocalories per gram, and alcohol 7 kilocalories per gram. So by logging all these different foods and using different dietary recall and diary approaches, you can have an estimation for how many calories you're consuming. But as we talk about in the course, there are pros and cons with all these different methodologies. And you find it's actually quite difficult to measure dietary intake in some individuals. We can look at the other end as well. We can look at energy expenditure. So you've looked at intake, but what if we want to know how many calories you're burning on a daily basis? So we can estimate this, okay? We can look at how many calories are burned at rest and also with physical activity. And typically we're interested in calories expended over a 24-hour period. But we can look at specific snapshots in time. So it could be during rest, it could be you're just doing some light walking or during intense exercise. But what we're trying to do is we try to relate back how food is metabolized by the body, how it's burned. And I'm going to give you some key examples here. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner here, you've got, someone tell me what this is. This is in the cell. It's an organelle within the cell where food nutrients are metabolized. So in the Q&A, can you tell us what this thing is in the bottom left-hand corner?
Amelia said the mitochondria.
Fantastic, and you're completely right. So this is essentially the powerhouse of the cell. This is where you produce all of your ATP, adenosine triphosphate, from the breakdown of fuels such as glucose and fat. Now, I'm assuming most of you guys in the room, so quite a few people said mitochondria, which is good. So I'm assuming most of you in the room are studying biology. Okay, so usually in biology, you'll study some basic metabolism. Now, at BSc level, we go into some depth, but you've probably heard of glycolysis before, so the breakdown of glucose. And you've probably heard of the TCA cycle before, Krebs cycle. So when you're oxidizing glucose, okay, so you break glucose down, there's a process in the mitochondria, okay, where you break it down, you break pyruvate down. You can see we go around this cycle here. And you can see at different points we produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct, okay? And then over here, so on the right-hand side, you can see actually within the mitochondria, this citric acid cycle, the Krebs cycle, is linked to something called the electron transport chain, which you may have heard of before. So what happens is here, you're coupling, you see all these hydrogen ions here, you basically have what we call electron proton motive force, and you couple this with ATP synthesis. Now, we won't go into any of the specifics today. The mechanisms are quite complex. The only thing I want you to recognize is that when you oxidize fuels, glucose and fats, you use oxygen, so oxygen here, and then you make water, and you produce carbon dioxide. Okay, so by relating this, you can relate this back. So by working out how much oxygen you consume and how much carbon dioxide you produce, you can relate that back to nutrient metabolism and energy expenditure. So you can see here, for example, okay, on the slide, by the way, just Anissa, can you see, I'm moving the Q&A around. Can you see that, or can you just see the slides?
No, we can just see the slides.
Fantastic, good. Otherwise it gets in the way, so I don't want that to be a pain. So you can see there's a difference here. So for example, with carbohydrate, again, you guys have probably done your basic biology and some basic chemistry. You probably remember that glucose is C6H12O6, for example. So when that's oxidized, okay, broken down in the mitochondria, we use, for 1 mole of glucose, we have 6 moles of oxygen goes to make 6 moles of CO2, carbon dioxide, okay? When you have fat, remember fat is very energy dense, okay? So you have this larger molecule here. Palmitic acid is an example of a fatty acid, C16H32O2. You need more oxygen. So 23 moles of oxygen, you produce more carbon dioxide. So we can relate all this back by working out how much oxygen you consume, how much carbon dioxide you produce. We can work out how much energy you require on a daily basis. There's another interesting thing as well, is that by looking at the ratio between CO2 produced and oxygen consumed, we call this respiratory quotient, RQ, we can assess whether someone is burning more fat or carbohydrate, and that's quite useful. And that's probably for another lecture, but it's a useful thing to know. And you can see here, this shows the differences between the different nutrients. So you've got glucose, so carbohydrates here, so starch and glucose compared to fat. I've just highlighted fat here because you can see you need a lot more oxygen to per unit, per gram of fat, you need a lot more oxygen compared to carbohydrate. And you can see it's got a lower RQ value as well. But the energy released in kilojoules per gram is 39, which is equivalent to 9 kilocalories per gram. So fat is very energy dense. So you can work all this, so you can relate everything back. You can relate it all back to metabolism. So by understanding, okay, that if you can measure oxygen consumption, if you can measure carbon dioxide production, okay, so I've got some examples here. So you could do it during rest, or you could do it during exercise, for example. This is typically what we do during our practicals. Okay, so for example, we get you to measure oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production. We use these things here, they're called Douglas bags, okay? So essentially you breathe into this apparatus and we collect air in this big bag, okay? So we can measure the volume of air within that bag, okay? And the proportions of O2 and CO2. We compare, for example, from inspired to expired air. So from this, we can work out volume of oxygen inspired, volume of carbon dioxide expired, and then using a very specific equation developed by Professor Weir about 60 years ago now, you can estimate energy expenditure in kilocalories per minute. When it's done properly, it can be near gold standard. So very accurate technique. And it can be used not just, for example, during rest or exercise, but also in clinical situations. So, for example, here on the right-hand side, this is an example of a ventilation hood used in ICU, in intensive care. And the reason we want to do this, okay, lots of different reasons. Can you tell us why, first of all? So just going back to our Q&A, can anyone tell us why this is important, do you think? Oh, there we go. I can see a question from Amelia actually as well. It's a complex question from Amelia. So it says, how come, all right, so I'll just quickly go back for one second. It says, Amelia says, how come fats are not burned as regularly as carbohydrates if they are more energy dense? Now, the answer is actually, at rest, our body predominantly burns fat as fuel, actually. When we eat a meal, when we secrete something called insulin, our body shifts to burning carbohydrates as fuel. And carbohydrates are very quick energy source. But during rest, during fasting in particular, and during prolonged exercise, for example, fats become a very important energy source. So there you go, Amelia. And we talk about that in our second and third years of the module. But why is this important? Why do you want to know energy expenditure? What would be so useful? For example, we had some examples here with athletes in clinical situations. Can anyone tell us why? Anyone on the call? Any athletes there? Why might it be useful to know energy expenditure accurately? Any ideas? Got Eva says, to assess those metabolic needs. You're completely right, Eva. That's exactly right. To assess metabolic needs. Very, very good. So, and then Amelia says again, you can assess how much energy needed. You can indeed. So, basically, so Eva, you're completely right. So, in these specific situations, the idea is that we can accurately assess energy needs. So, example for an athlete might be for optimizing performance or to prevent weight loss. So we know, for example, in Tour de France athletes, in ultra endurance athletes, sorts of people who run a number of marathons in a very short period of time, for example, it's a very stressful situation, and it's a very energy consuming process. Okay, so when you exercise at a very high intensity for a long period of time, you use a lot of calories. So because of that, it means you can lose a lot of weight, and some athletes become malnourished. Okay, some of them have eating disorders as well. It becomes quite complex. But that's why you'll see, for example, in an elite athlete situation, then typically you'll find that exercise physiologists try to estimate energy expenditure using this type of technique. In a clinical setting, it's obviously very important to avoid undereating and avoid overfeeding. And especially in critical care settings like ICU, it can be, it's a life-threatening situation. Then by underfeeding or overfeeding can make things better or worse. And we talk about this in depth in the modules that we cover. So, for example, in our final year, third year of study, we have a specific sports nutrition module where we talk about these sorts of things, and a clinical nutrition module called applied nutrition. So, for example, in the applied nutrition module, we talk about the management of these different conditions. So, for example, in ICU or in cancer, for example, we have dietitians from UCL Hospital and Royal Free Hospital talking about these sorts of aspects where we need to manage these conditions by nutrition. So, for example, energy needs and needs for things like macronutrients such as protein becomes absolutely critical. So being able to assess this is essential. What about measuring body size and composition? How can we do this? So we've talked about body mass index, but is there anything else that we could do? By the way, Yasmin, I'm just looking at the Q&A, that's a really good point. So she says, if it's too high, so if energy expenditure is too high, athletes may be burning protein, which is not desirable. You're completely right. So if the energy expenditure is too high, and if you're not matching that with energy intake, then essentially you're using up your reserves. Now you'll use up fat, but you may use protein as well. So it means you're losing muscle tissue. So that's a very good point, Yasmin. But back to this. So what could we also do? So obviously you're measuring body mass index. So here we go. So anonymous attendees are calculating fat mass, muscle mass. Very good. Thank you very much. Waist to hip ratio. Very good. So there's something called the in-body assessment. Have you got any idea what the in-body assessment is? Amelia, have you got any idea what in-body assessment? And Molly says skin fold test. So you mean skin fold caliper measurements? So measuring subcutaneous fat. That's very good. And you can do that at home, absolutely. A very easy, non-invasive method. So Amelia, I'm thinking you probably mean bioelectrical impedance. There's a specific device called the in-body bioelectrical impedance assessment device. I'm assuming you probably mean that. And then you can measure things like fat mass and muscle mass, different body compartments. Thanks, everyone. So we can estimate the amount of tissue the body has. Now, you just got to remember that all the energy, okay, the way the body stores energy. Now, for example, we have storage of glucose as glycogen within muscle and liver, but the body has a very small amount of glycogen, for example. We can have fat, for example, and we can store fat a little bit within muscle again, but most of the fat is subcutaneous fat, so the fat underneath the skin. We have some other fat, for example, around the organs, so visceral fat, and we also have obviously reserves of protein, which most of that is muscle tissue, okay, and organs. So we can try to estimate this. Now, the easiest way to do it is the body mass index. So I'm sure you've all seen this before on TV or on the news, and everything seems to be run by the BMI. Now, this is all well and good. It gives a rough idea, it gives an estimation of body size, and we can relate that back to disease risk. So you look on the right-hand side here. This is from diabetes.co.uk, and you're probably fully aware of this, that if you have a much higher body mass index, okay, in a normal population, you tend to be at a high risk of disease and a high risk of mortality, okay? So it's something to take note of, but it's not wholly accurate. And I just want to highlight something interesting here. So just as an example. So for example, you've got these 5 individuals here, okay? So they've all got the same weight. So obviously just measuring body weight. So how useful is that, okay? But they've got different heights, okay? And if you look here, this is WC, this is waist circumference, different waist circumferences. SM is skeletal muscle mass, okay? So you can see, look at the difference between these guys. And if you look at body mass index, you can see that the reference individual is a BMI of 24.2, okay? The tall chap has a BMI of 20.9. The short guy has a BMI of 30.3. So this chap is essentially obese, okay? So same body weight here, different height, and you can see here has a higher waist circumference, okay? And a lower skeletal muscle mass. The guys on the right-hand side are quite interesting because they have a very normal BMI. So this is normal weight, not at risk of any disease, apparently, okay? But they're very different. So the chap on the left here is muscular and the chap on the right is inactive. And you can see the differences here, for example, in waist circumference. So the chap on the right has a much higher waist circumference, which means they're storing fat in the abdominal region, both subcutaneously and viscerally. So that fat around the organs, for example. And the chap on the right has a lower amount of muscle mass. So this is why we're just trying to get across to people, and this is what we do when we do proper nutritional assessments, that measuring body weight alone or measuring body weight and height is not enough. It only gives you a rough estimation. So what can we do? So we can do a proper body composition assessment, okay? So some of you guys said in the chat, which is really good. For example, someone said, looking at fat mass and fat-free mass, for example, or the in-body assessment, which is, I assume you mean using bioelectrical impedance, for example. But we can look at different body compartments. So the way the body is made up of, we've got fat-free mass and fat mass, okay? So the fat-free mass is everything that isn't fat. So skeletal muscle mass, your organs, your heart, liver, lungs, for example, kidneys, etc. Okay, and then you have obviously bone tissue, bone minerals, and then water, which is obviously within the cells and outside of the cells. So we call extracellular water as well. So we can look at this using different techniques. We can do some simple anthropometric techniques, and we can do some more advanced techniques such as scanning, bioelectrical impedance, or imaging techniques. And we can look at these specific compartments. We can look at the two-compartment model for body composition, that's fat mass and fat-free mass, or we can break it down and look at things like skeletal muscle mass as well. So for some basic anthropometry, and again, this is the sort of stuff we do in practical sessions in the course, okay? We can, for example, measure limb circumferences. We can look at waist circumference here, for example. We can look at mid-upper arm circumference. We can look at calf circumference, which is a good measure, for example, of lower limb muscle mass, for example. And we can also look at skin fold thickness. So by having a combination of the circumference of the limb plus skin fold measurement using a caliper, you can see on the right-hand side here, this is taking the tricep, the back of the arm. Okay, we can have an estimation of body fat and fat-free mass. And obviously we use specific equations and which have been validated, but it gives us a better estimation of body composition. Now, when we're using these skin fold calipers, typically what we do, we use a minimum of a four sites of measurements. So typically we use tricep, we use bicep at the front of the arm, suprailiac just above the hip there, and subscapular at the back. And using a specific equation that was validated some years ago, we can estimate fat mass and fat-free mass. Again, like I say, we do that in class, and it's a very cheap and practical, portable technique that you could do yourselves. For example, if you become a private nutritionist. We can also do bioelectrical impedance. Okay, so bioelectrical impedance is actually a technique where you put a very small, harmless current through the body, and you measure resistance to current. Okay, and there are different components to this, okay, that we won't talk about today, but essentially what it means is you can have an estimation of body compartment size. You can work out through specific equations fat mass, fat-free mass, and body water, and in some equations you can work out muscle mass as well. It's again a very simple and harmless technique. So you can see the top right-hand corner here, this is a typical body stat device. So it's a very simple, portable bit of kit, You've got some electrodes here that you put in the hands and the feet. So we're using the electrode pads there. Other devices, for example, are where you stand on some scales and you've got electrodes on the base. And again, we do this in module practical sessions. There are more advanced techniques that you can do. Now, typically, these are not done as part of routine practice, but you can do things like DEXA, so dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. There's also things like magnetic resonance imaging and computed tomography. So if any of you, for example, it could be you've hurt your knee or something with playing football, you might, for example, had an MRI done to check for, say, tendon tears, for example. Or it could be your mum or your nan, for example, might have had a fall or a fracture, for example. And typically what happens when you go to the NHS is you might be assessed, for example, for bone mineral density, and you use a DEXA scan to do that as part of routine practice. Okay, so a DEXA scan, if you look at the figure here, is an example of a DEXA. We can see in blue, you can see the skeleton. So you can measure bone mineral density using this technique. And then at the same time, if you look on the outside in red, you can see the fat-free mass, so all your organs and skeletal muscle mass. So this is a reference standard technique for measuring these compartments. You can see on the outside here as well, all the subcutaneous fat. So it's a really good technique. You can also use things like MRI and CT, and these are quite interesting. You can see on the right-hand side, this is an example of an MRI. So in these techniques, it's quite useful. This is a cross-section of the abdominal area, and you can see the muscle. This is in the muscles in the back and around the spine there. So you look at muscle, but what's interesting is that not only see in blue, you can measure the subcutaneous adipose tissue, but in yellow, you've got the visceral adipose tissue around all the organs. But what's also interesting in green here, these green little dots, you can measure fat infiltration in muscle. This is advanced. You wouldn't be doing this as part of routine practice. And typically all these techniques are only done as part of advanced diagnostics or in research, or more recently in private practice, for example, with elite athletes. So you find lots of elite athletes now going for DEXA scans to measure the fat-free mass using this reference standard technique. So I hope you found that interesting. That was a very brief overview of how to measure body energy balance and why it's really important. So let me just check my time. So I'll make it 5:10 nearly now. So I'm just going to go through the course for about another 5 to 10 minutes. So we have a really successful BSc Nutrition Medical Sciences degree, and it's accredited with the Association for Nutrition, which we're really happy about. When we have full accreditation, it's a real advantage. Because it means that at the end of the course, you come out as being associate registered nutritionists, and it gives you a step up in terms of careers. So you find lots of jobs now, for example, are asking for either associate registered nutritionists or full registered nutritionists. So we're very pleased that we've had this set up on our course. So we have an interesting course. It's a novel course. Okay, there's no other course like it in the United Kingdom. In our first year, we have a common set of modules which is aligned with applied medical sciences. So typically in the first year we find that the nutrition students do most of their modules with other courses such as applied medical sciences, where they're exploring physiology and pathophysiology, and that gives a really good backbone and background to understanding more complex things in the second and third year. And you find in the second and third year we cover metabolism in great depth. For example, we have this obesity malnutrition module that I mentioned earlier. We also talk about growth and development. So we talk about everything that occurs before pregnancy, during pregnancy, childhood growth and nutrition, all the way to aging. And then our final year of study, we have some very specialized modules, the clinical nutrition ones that I mentioned, and also sports nutrition. But we also have modules on behavioral nutrition in the developed world, which has become obviously very important to understand nutrition from a social and psychological perspective, and also things like frailty and aging. The other thing as well, we have this particular interest with cancer. We have a division of cancer here at UCL, and we work very closely with some of our colleagues there. And we have two specific modules which are optional modules on the course. We have a nutrition and cancer risk module in the second year, and that looks at specifically a relationship between certain foods, for example, and cancer risk. And so, for example, red meat and alcohol, for example, how they relate to cancer risk. And in the third year, we have a specific module on nutrition and cancer treatment. So this is basically looking at what happens once someone has cancer. So typically what happens for many people is that there's a decrease in body weight. There's the presence of something called cachexia in some cases, where you have this loss of weight that ultimately links to poor clinical outcomes. So we talk about that in great depth. And then we have other modules as well. For example, we have a specific module on the microbiome. This is the course structure for the year 2. And essentially we cover loads of metabolism at the end of year 1, but then we go into more depth in term 1 of year 2. And that leads on very nicely to linking up with this malnourishment and obesity module, when we talk about everything from undernutrition all the way to overnutrition. We talk about things like eating disorders and type 2 diabetes, for example. And then as well in the first term, we cover the molecular basis of disease. So covering some very, I would say some standard clinical conditions, but also some very novel clinical conditions from a molecular perspective. So for example, looking at genetic disorders, for example, inherited disorders and disorders related to altered immune function, for example. Then we have this nutrition and cancer risk module as well that I mentioned earlier. And in term 2, we have the growth and development module and then a research methods module. And the research methods module in particular sets you up very nicely for the dissertation in the 3rd year. And you also do a bit of statistics as well, which is also again very helpful for understanding how to handle data and how to analyze data, which becomes important for your 3rd year dissertation. In the 3rd year, we cover these specialized modules, which we're very pleased to offer actually. So we have this clinical nutrition, applied nutrition module in term 1. We have sports nutrition as well. We have this behavioral nutrition module. We have some specific optional modules, so some that I mentioned earlier, like for example, microbiome. And then in term 2, we have a specific public health nutrition epidemiology module. We have a module related to frailty and aging. And then we have these other specific optional modules that I mentioned earlier related to cancer treatment. Another new module called nutrition, health and culture, which looks at anthropological relationships with health. So lots of social and cultural aspects of nutrition and health. And you can see at the bottom here, we have the dissertation research project that spans across both terms. And so for the dissertation, for example, you might want to do a research project where you're actually collecting some data. It could be you're working in a laboratory environment, or it could be you're taking human data. So it could be, for example, you're doing dietary intake studies or measuring energy expenditure or body composition, for example. We also offer other different types of projects, such as literature reviews as well. If you're interested in more covering the literature in some depth, we offer that as well. In terms of our expertise with teaching, okay, so I just want to highlight here that UCL really is a world leader. It's a very research intensive university that I'm sure you're probably aware, and that filters through to our teaching. So you'll find that our course is very much research led, okay? And we talk about all the very most important current scientific trends and discoveries. And we have many examples of our modules where we have some really fantastic modules where we have eminent professors from all over UCL giving key lectures for different modules. And a good example here is we have our growth and development module, where we have 4 different professors from UCL giving lectures on pregnancy, infant feeding, childhood growth. And these guys are really leaders in the field. These guys have actually written the textbooks, okay, on nutritional requirements, for example, during pregnancy or childhood. So we're very proud to be able to say that about our course, that is very research led, but also practice focused as well. So for example, we have lots of dietitians and clinicians come on to talk about things such as clinical nutrition. So in the applied nutrition module, most of the course is taught by dietitians from either UCL Hospital or Royal Free Hospital up in Hampstead. And again, we're very lucky that we can offer this, and it gives the whole course a real specialised and unique feel. In terms of assessment strategy, the idea is we're trying to develop a whole range of transferable skills in the course. The idea is it's then going to help you in your future career. So we do all sorts of things. In our first year, you might have some basic exams. So things like multiple choice question exams, just to test basic knowledge. But after that, things get much more interesting and much more complex, for example. So for example, you might do short answer question exams. You have lots of presentation assessments, both individually and as a group. And the idea, it gives you guys lots of chances to practice presenting in different formats as well. So whether it's a PowerPoint presentation or as a poster, for example, or as a video project even as well. And it means it gives you that experience which will become absolutely vital in a future career, or even just going for a job interview. And we find that this stuff is just so important. There's lots of other different types of written assessments as well. So we get you guys doing practical reports. So on the stuff that we talked about today, for example, with the energy expenditure practical and the body composition practical that we have in our year 2 of study, we get you guys actually writing a practical report that follows the INRAD method. So what we mean by that is where you have a report, a succinct report with an abstract, an introduction, a method section, a results section where you're highlighting all the different data, the results, the figures and tables, for example, data, and then a discussion and then references at the end. And that's really, really useful to have, because it's about understanding how to write a report in the first place, but that could become really important for your dissertation, and also if you go on to do further research later on. So with MSc or PhD studies. We also have case studies as well. Again, that's a very important for best examples if you want to go into clinical nutrition. So in the clinical nutrition module, we do specific case studies, same in the frailty and aging module. And again, you might come across true clinical scenarios later on where you have to take on whatever the situation is and understand, for example, how many calories do you need to give a certain patient with, say, chronic kidney disease, or how many grams of protein, for example. What's the rationale behind that? What's the evidence? And you discuss that at depth. Then we have some more other types of novel types of assessments. So we do have different types of open book exam types of assessment, or business case studies as well. And as I said to you at the beginning, our course is fully accredited. So it's an accredited program of the Association for Nutrition. And that's basically really important. I strongly suggest you guys look up. So if you Google the Association for Nutrition and see what it's all about, essentially it's a registered charity. And the main aim of it is to essentially enhance the whole nutrition field, and it is meant to protect and benefit the public. So you'll see, for example, straight away on the homepage, there's a register for nutritionists. So for example, if you put my surname in, you'll see that I come up as being a registered nutritionist. Okay, and the idea is trying to protect the public, where you have a listing of full registered nutritionists and associate registered nutritionists who've covered a scientific based degree. Okay, now at the end of it, it means that once you become you graduate and you become an associate registered nutritionist or a full registered nutritionist, it means you can do lots of different things and work in different fields. It could be, for example, you work in a food science or food company, and some of those companies, for example, are very well known. So examples of clinical nutrition companies that produce food supplements for patients in hospitals, for example, and that'd be, again, an obvious choice for some of you who are interested in clinical-based nutrition. It could be working in public health or working in food policy, for example. And we've had some of our undergraduate and postgraduate students go off to work in public health. It could be you have an interest in academia, so teaching or research, you want to do a PhD. And it means that, again, it gives you a lead. This whole course is designed to be very science-based. So then you could go off to study a PhD afterwards. Sports and exercise as well. Also work in the NHS. So for example, you find in the NHS, there are some more newer roles available where you can work not just as a dietitian, but also specific for nutritionists. So if you look closely, there've been some roles more recently where they've been advertising for community nutritionists. So it could be, for example, working with weight loss programs, or trying to reduce malnutrition risk in the elderly, for example. And there've been specific roles now out there for accredited nutritionists. Or it could be you want to work with clients on an individual basis, giving nutritional advice. And again, that's something you can do as well. And you find that most of our graduates have gone on to do these different things. Specifically, a lot of people go on to do postgraduate study, for example, in sports nutrition, public health and epidemiology, for example, even drug design. But I've just highlighted here dietetics because Anissa's helping us today, and she's gone on to study dietetics. And after this, I'm going to let her take over and tell you a bit about her experience on the course. But our course is very much focused in particular with this in mind. So it's a very, as I mentioned, it's a very novel course. It's very medical sciences focused. So in the first year, it's all essentially applied medical sciences, where you cover the basics of physiology and pathophysiology. But then in the second and third years, you'll cover these specific modules such as malnourishment and obesity and the applied nutrition module that are very clinically focused. You'll cover all the key topics of interest, okay? For example, whether it's obesity, eating disorder, for example, clinical conditions, for example, in the applied nutrition module, we cover nutritional management of cancer, for example, chronic kidney disease, liver disease, intensive care nutrition, motor neuron disease, for example. So a whole range of different conditions. And again, this course, this degree, is then, again, a very good step up to not only studying dietetics, but we also at UCL, we have another, a whole range of postgraduate courses, including MSc Clinical Public Health Nutrition. We also have an MSc in Eating Disorders and Clinical Nutrition, and an MSc in Obesity and Clinical Nutrition. So you can see that we've essentially got a very specialised course here, that if you're interested and you've got a clinical interest, then it's definitely something you should consider. And I'd be very happy to take any questions. And then whilst we're waiting for questions, maybe Anissa, maybe you want to just give a little bit of background of your experience.
I just want to say there was 2 questions, but not about the course, but regarding the energy expenditure talk that you were giving.
Oh, okay. Do you want me to have a look?
Yeah, so one was from Yasmin, who said, does visceral fat show up on the DEXA scan? Which I think you answered in the talk.
Yeah, I mean, if you're really that interested, if there's no other questions, I could quickly show you an example. So I'll tell you what, let's have some course-related questions.
Yeah.
If we, you know, we've finished and there's a little bit of time, then I'll show you something in a minute, Yasmin. How's that?
With regards to my experience, so I did of course, Adrian said I did the nutrition and medical science program first, which just to kind of reiterate what you were saying, it is very varied in terms of you get professors from all different types of fields and from different types of places. So then the likelihood of you being able to meet a professor or talk to a professor that is an expert in something that you're interested in is very high, because it's not just the same professors over and over again who are specialized in one different field. You get all over the world, like all over the country, like different professors teaching you. So that was very cool to me, that you just get experts in all the fields. And then also with the assessments, it may seem like a lot, but then it also gives you practice in so many different areas and so many different like assessment, like things that you might have to do, like for example presentations or like case studies or business proposals, which most likely you will have to do after you graduate. So it kind of prepares you a little bit for what you might have to do as a career and what you might have to do once you finish the course. So I thought that was very good in terms of it's not just exams based. So because once you've come out of the education world, once you come out into your career, it's not like that. You're not going to have exams every year. You're going to have to do presentations. You're going to have to assess case studies. You're going to have to do so many different things. So I think having that like practice, that even a little bit of practice helps a lot.
Anissa, what do you enjoy the most?
With the undergrad course, I think I enjoyed the teaching, like just the quality of the teaching the most, just the different professors that you get. I think that was the thing that stood out to me the most, because I don't think you would get that at loads of different unis, especially coming onto the MSc course now as well, with so many different people coming from so many different courses and hearing their experiences.
This is it might sound like it sounds like we're bragging, but I've worked at different places before myself, and I'm fully aware of how these things tend to work. And we're just incredibly lucky that UCL is such an amazing large institution that's very research focused. And so, like say, we have experts in all different fields from all over the place. So whether it's the Institute of Child Health, or we have the dietitians and clinicians at the hospital, or we have, for example, the public health epidemiology department, for example. You know, we have all these different experts who all contribute. So it really enhances the modules. It makes it really fantastic, because essentially these guys, you know, they've written the textbooks, you know, the textbooks that we advise you guys to read, you know, some of them have actually written them in the first place, which is pretty amazing.
We have got some questions so Molly was asking, what are the requirements to get into this course, and is there anything you can do to help you stand out, and if you have any recommendations for work experience places related to this field?
Yeah, so all the recommendations, all the requirements are on the website, but in particular the key things is obviously biology and chemistry is absolutely key. Now, in terms of work experience, okay, now my personal suggestion, if you have the time available and you want to, you know, is if you can get, for example, even if it's a few hours, for example, it doesn't have to be like a part-time job, but just get some experience of, for example, lab work, laboratory-based work, to see what you enjoy, because you might not like lab work at all, but you find that the course that we have in the first year is very much laboratory-based biochemistry type lab work. So I see there's another question at the bottom about biochemistry related stuff. But once you get to second and third years, you know, it changes. So it's less lab based, and it's more to do with, you know, human nutritional assessment. So for example, the stuff that I mentioned today, you know, things like measuring gas exchange, measuring body composition, for example, measuring dietary intake. Okay, so you'll cover all the biochemistry stuff in the first year, okay, but then it becomes more integrated, okay, across the board, and you'll cover all different aspects. The other thing you could do, Molly, as well, is if you could try and find out early on what you're interested in, that would be really helpful. So if you've got an interest, for example, in potentially working in a hospital with patients, for example, that would be really good to identify that early on. Because if you want to go and do dietetics afterwards, you know, after the BSc course, then you need to get that relevant experience. And that is really, really important. Wouldn't you agree, Anissa, for your, yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, because before, so I took a year out and then I was working through that year to get that experience.
Yeah. And so it is actually essential, isn't it, for dietetics?
Yeah, definitely.
So if you can identify early on the sorts of things you're interested in, whether it is biochemistry or if it's food related, because that's another important point, to be honest, this is not a food science course at all. You know, we talk about food in different contexts, but it's not a typical food science, food chemistry course. Okay, so just to make that very clear, it's much more clinical focused and public health focused, if that helps everyone. Amelia asked how many students do you accept onto the course. So just to give you a feel, our current first year is, I think we've got about 28 to 29 students at the moment. So that's just to give you a rough idea.
I think when I was, it was about 14 of us, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And would you say that was, did you prefer that, or?
You do become a lot more close when it's just,
You do,
yeah, which is quite nice.
It is
it's
nice.
Similar to the dietetics course, because even that is quite new. So there's only 10 of us, and we all just get very close to each other.
Yeah. So the way it works in the first year, there's obviously a lot of you because you're all doing these core modules. Okay, and then when you do the nutrition modules, it becomes much more specialized. But what we find is most of the students, probably like 95% of the students, prefer it in the nutrition modules, because you might only have up to, say, 35 students on the module, and it makes it much more interesting, and it's close. It means you can chat with your colleagues, chat to the lecturers much easier. It's a much nicer environment. Any other questions, anyone? I can see we're starting to run out of time. Make it 5
Yeah.
p.m.
I think if there's no more questions, then we might have to say finish it up.
That's good. Any last questions, guys? I mean, obviously, you can email us. You can go onto the website. Anything at all, just give us a shout. Oh, hold on a minute. We've got something here. Amelia says, as you get into second and third year, will you be grouped with people studying different courses based on the modules you take? So the way it works, the reason I highlighted those second and third year modules, Amelia, so these are core nutrition modules. Okay, so some of those core nutrition modules we take on students from other courses. Okay, but typically the size of the module is not, it's not any bigger than, say, that 35 students. That's the largest module that we have. And in the final year modules, which are some of the modules we only allow nutrition students on those modules, you might have, for example, under 20 students, if that helps. And someone, the anonymous attendee says, applying for medicine, choosing this BSc is fifth choice. Well, I'm pleased to hear it's your fifth choice. We have actually quite a lot of students who are either applying for medicine or want to do medicine later. So, and especially there's the other course that we're affiliated with, Applied Medical Sciences. We have lots of students who go off to do graduate entry medicine, for example. And we've had one or two of our course who have gone on to try and get onto graduate entry medicine. So if you want to do this nutrition degree first, you could do, then you can apply later. So nice to have you here anyway.
Okay, so I think, so we are out of time now, so we need to leave it there. But if you could provide us with your feedback about today's session, would be very helpful for us. And there's a survey in the chat which you can fill out. So, oh, Amelia did just say thank you for running this taste course.
Thanks, Amelia. Hope to see you next year.
Hopefully. So thank you for all your comments and questions, and thank you to Dr. Slee for an excellent session. And I think we'll end it there. Have a great evening.
Thanks, Anissa. Cheers. Thanks, everyone. All the best. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.